At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? Welcome back. If you've heard a few of these podcasts, you'll know by now that we don't just talk about trees here. We branch out and stray off the beaten track into all kinds of fascinating subjects, and this episode is a humdinger in that respect. I met with friend, fellow veteran tree nut, and bat guru Jim Mulholland at Savernake Forest, ahead of him launching his brand new Bats and Trees Masterclass. See the show notes for details of that one if you want to book on. And as you'll hear, we cover all sorts from bat poo, bat discos, Batman, right through to neurodiversity in the world of science, and why Die Hard 1's opening sequence is something we can all take lessons from. Come join us for a seat on the forest floor to tune in. How are you doing?
All right, thank you. Yeah, life is very good.
This is the first The Meaning of Trees podcast episode that's been recorded on a forest floor. I have literally got my knees in a pile of beech leaves.
It's cool, isn't it?
It's lovely, yeah. And I don't know if the rustle will come through in the edit.
And Willow, the dog, is making her way around the microphone now. So if you can hear the rustling beech leaves, that's Willow wanting to get involved with the podcast.
Yeah, I think Willow is acting as Jim's agent today. So if I ask him anything difficult, I expect to get a pretty hard stare and I will back off. He knows about my podcast and to date has been quite complimentary, which is lovely. But yeah, we'll see how that goes, shall we, Willow? We are sat between two pretty ginormous beech trees with lovely Ganoderma fungal brackets on their bases. Plenty of old graffiti there. I see Brooks and Fazza G05, Louis 08. Clearly an important local dwelling spot here. And it just feels like exactly the right environment to be asking you, Jim, what trees mean to you.
Trees, I'm in awe of trees. And I think for me, they help me better understand the world and my place in it. That they have a plan for life, but as with any plan, it doesn't always end up going that way. And so they can adapt and they're resilient and they change and respond to the environment that they're in. And so I take a lot away from that in the way I think about my life and what I want to achieve and what we're all trying to do in the nature conservation movement of really raising the profile, helping people understand how important these things are to help us conserve them.
And where did that begin then? So where did your own interest and buy-in with that kind of cause begin?
I've always been fascinated by living things and didn't know what I wanted to do for a career, but have always enjoyed the sciences, in particular biology. Had a fantastic headmaster at senior school that encouraged me to study science. And I've kind of just followed it from there on in. And one of the reasons why I thought it would be great to meet in Savernake Forest is because this is where my bat journey began. But I also think is where my ancient tree journey began, that I've spent time around these amazing trees like the two beech trees that you've mentioned. I've actually stayed the night here before, I think on several occasions when we were out catching bats and radio tracking bats. So whilst I was studying and researching bats here, I was just in the company of some amazing trees, in particular the oaks and beech veterans here. And it was my first experience of ancient woodland. And I kind of assumed all ancient woodland was like this with these amazing old trees in it. And it was only when I went to other ancient woodlands and found out, actually, no, this is quite a rarity, and clearly now with more knowledge, understand this comes from the fact it was an open habitat with these amazing trees that had space around them that grew into these open spreading crowns that then form the kind of foundation for so much of the fantastic wildlife that's here. And this woodland, my involvement has mainly been with barbastelle bats. And if you read the literature on barbastelle bats, they seem to make some very poor life choices. The places they choose to live, that we term roosts, are either very exposed and provide very little shelter or protection from the environment, or they're just very short-lived. So they quite frequently turn up under lifting bark, and lifting bark in itself doesn't last very long. It's quite often on dead limbs or dead trees, and those themselves don't last very long. This morning, wandering around looking at some of the trees that we found here last year when we did some radio tracking of barbastelle, one of the trees has fallen over, and that's the second of 11 trees we found in July last year that are now gone. And it was very odd that no wonder this species is rare, because it makes these really poor life choices. But actually, if you give them the choice, come to a woodland like this with these fantastic old trees, then actually they've got fantastic taste. It's just most of the time they're forced into bits of habitat where their only choice is to end up living under lifting bark on dead trees.
So what do bats mean to you then?
I think they're a bit of a metaphor, I guess, of the quest for knowledge and information, that they are nocturnal. They tuck themselves away into the tiniest features on trees. They move every few days. There's so many questions we need to still answer about bats. And we have 18 different species in the UK. 14 of them live in trees. Some of them are hardcore and they live in trees all year round. Others are quite flexible and they can live in trees, they can live in buildings, they can live in bat boxes. And so much of the little we know about bats is based on bats in buildings and bats in caves where you can get inside and you can physically see the bats. Whereas the ones in trees, the ones I'm really interested in, are just much more challenging to study. And what we know about bats in buildings quite often gets applied to bats in trees because we've got to start somewhere. But in actual fact, their ecology is very, very different. So I think for me, the reason why I ended up studying bats, first of all, shout out to Laura, my now wife. I met her at university and she was into bats. I was into her. So that was kind of my entry into bats. And I've continued because there is so much to learn about it. These crazy animals that most people just don't even see. And the big joy of my work and the focus in the last few years in particular has tried to capture that as well as I possibly can with photos, videos, and then show that to people. Because if people don't see these animals, these species, how can we expect them to care about them?
So the last 10 years, you've really kind of been going deep into tree bat observation, actually, I would say. And that's still going because actually when I met with you in the car park at Savernake, you were showing me this super cool new kit that you've got, which I got to have a go on actually. But yeah, before I murder what that's all about, why don't you describe that one for me there, Jim?
I can take you on the journey of those 10 years if you like.
Let's do it.
We started by just going out and trying to find trees that looked interesting. Spotted features on the trees that we thought bats could live in, and we climbed them. And if we found bats or we thought they were suitable, we then would come back once a month and do that for a whole year. And I naively thought at that time that once we've got a year's worth of data, then we'll know so much more about bats in trees and we'll really kind of crack this one and crack the conservation of these species. With hindsight, that's ridiculous because that sample size is still only 12 days out of 365. And we know that these species move really frequently, perhaps every 3 to 4 days. And up until recently, we never really knew why. And that work continued and I changed it slightly. So some of the initial criticism of the work was like, okay, but that's fine. The bats you're finding, these roosts are the transitionary ones. The bats just use occasionally. The roosting ecology of bats is quite complex. They have a very distinct annual cycle, and female bats gather together to give birth to their young in the summer, whereas the males are separate. They then mate in the autumn and then hibernate over the winter. And they need different roosts in different locations throughout that whole process. So whether it's an adult or juvenile, whether it's a male or female, even if the female's in breeding condition or not, they all choose slightly different things. So that's why they need so many different roosting locations. So one of the early criticisms was, okay, well, those are transitional roosts. So we sought to address that by finding the important sites, the maternity sites where the females come together to give birth and raise their young. So we did that by radio tracking, putting a small tag on the back of some Bechstein's bats and Barberstale bats, follow them to the tree. And in the following year, we climbed each of those trees once a month to see how many times we came across bats. So the first year, I'll ask you a question actually, Tom. Bechstein's bats, one of our rarest bats in the UK. It's what's known as an Annex 2 species, which is the highest level of protection you can get if you're a bat. Okay, you're going to have sites designated for you. Maternity roosts, so the most important type of roost for the conservation of the species. So rarest bat, one of the rarest bats, one of the most important types of roosts. We climbed those 12 times. There were 4 of those. So to my logic, that's 48 opportunities to find bats. How many times do you think we found bats during that first year?
I'm going to say a moderate 10.
Moderate 10? I can only dream of 10. We found them once.
Wow.
And if you think about the implications of that, I started my career in ecological consultancy. There's a whole industry built on ecologists going out and undertaking surveys to inform development and to inform them of their legal responsibility about whether there's bats present, because the places where they live, the roosts are protected. If we're just not finding bats when we know a roost is present, like how can we conserve those species? So it really raised alarm bells and made me realize, well, what we're doing is just not good enough. So that then led on to trying to use some off-the-shelf trail cameras and deploying those outside of the holes and trees to see if we could find bats. And I initially deployed one camera for 1 month, and I came back the following month. That was when we were doing the monthly checks. And would you know it, we had bats on the camera. So within 1 month, the camera outdid the human surveyors. And so that kind of demonstrated the proof of concept. I then sought some funding from the People's Trust for Endangered Species and the Arbor Association. And they were kind enough to fund a 5-year research project, which is just coming to an end, where we ramped up the scale of this and deployed more cameras on tree roosts. And it worked. It's not perfect. These cameras were designed for slow, large mammals, badgers, deer, etc. And I'm using them on small, fast-moving mammals. So we don't necessarily catch them leaving the tree, but we do get them going back in because they do this weird thing of landing on the entrance and then jumping off and then landing again and jumping off. And because of that, you pick up that activity and quite often get them then climbing into the hole. So that's a huge step forward. We're now seeing the development of bespoke cameras that record constantly. That will be another step forward. And the thing you mentioned was a thermal scope. And we used this last year. It has a very niche application. So our Barberstale bats, I mentioned already, quite frequently found under lifting bark on dead trees. And the problem with lifting bark is that it's very delicate. So if you were to climb it, you could risk damaging it. They're quite often on trees that are unsafe to climb. So even if you didn't damage it, you wouldn't necessarily want to send someone up there. But equally, they don't develop the field signs that a cavity does. So I talked about bats moving so frequently. They're more likely to be somewhere else than where you're looking on the day. The thing we borrowed from bats in buildings was looking for droppings, because in roof spaces, they're dry, sterile environments. The bats hang up at the apex of the roof, they deposit their droppings, they dry out and they stay there for potentially years. And so the thought was always, okay, well, we wouldn't find the bats, but you might find the droppings. How many times do you think we found droppings in those 48 opportunities?
48 opportunities. How many bat poos? Let's go for 5 at least.
2. And it's because they're ecosystems, right? The bats are depositing them, and they're a whole magnitude of bacteria, fungi, invertebrates that live on whatever detritus comes out of a cavity, whether that's decaying wood or excretions from animals, dead chicks in nests, for example. And so the droppings themselves aren't a reliable indicator. One of the best things is how smooth, how clean the substrate is. So if you think about the last time you went for a walk and you went through a kissing gate, you have a look at where people put their hands, either on the wood or that metal clasp that goes left and right. Quite often that wood or metal is polished. And it's the action of hands over time just wearing it away. And the same principle happens in trees, inside cavities. That initially it's solid wood. It gets broken down by fungi. That's kind of quite coarse material with loose bits falling out of it. As vertebrates come in and out of it, they knock all of that loose and eventually clean and polish that. And so that's one of our most reliable indicators. But for lifting bark, you don't get anywhere near that before the bark falls off the tree. So putting all those things together, delicate features, quite often dead trees, and it doesn't develop the kind of field signs. You can imagine droppings aren't going to collect, so they're going to fall out the bottom. It's a really challenging feature to survey. It's quite often the ones where you have conflict with tree risk management as well, because you've got dead sections or dead trees. And what we set about last year was to try and work out, could we use thermal imaging to actually spot bats beneath the bark during the day? And it turns out you can. It's very cool. I originally thought you might need a direct line of sight, so you'd have to stand at the bottom of the tree looking straight up. But actually you can see them through the bark. We had them on birch trees and oak trees, and even oak was quite thick, gnarly bark. You could see this ball of heat. And what's amazing as well as using it during the day, you can of course use thermal imaging at night and you can see the bats come out. And what happens is once all the mums leave to go and feed, you're left with a ball of heat, which is the baby bats tucked beneath the bark. And you wait long enough, then the mums come back and feed them. And so you can actually infer the babies are there. We kind of had to just guess that they were there before, but you can see the heat signature that's left.
Awesome. And that's non-invasive as well, isn't it? So ticking lots of boxes for being able to create conditions that keep the bats protected and undisturbed, really. I wonder if you can just give us a quick run through the main tree bat species. You mentioned a couple there, but if you were going to give us a quick rundown and profile of the different bats that you typically study, what would they be?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned that there are 14 of the UK's bat species, 14 out of 18 that live in trees. And the ones that I'm involved with are the ones that are tree specialists. So they have 2 bats which are quite rare. They're in that Annex 2 category. So that's our Bechstein's bats and Barbastelle bats. But despite them both being tree specialists, their roosting ecology is quite different. So Bechstein's is what we call a void dweller. So it likes features like woodpecker holes and cavities, whereas Barbastelle is a crevice dweller. So it likes to tuck itself away behind bark or in splits and cracks. So their preferences are quite different. They both also seem to head underground in the winter months. So they hang around maybe till about December time, but come January, February, most of them would have gone underground to hibernate where the conditions are much more stable.
What do you mean when you say underground?
So naturally that would be things like caves. But as humans have altered the landscape, you get quarries, you get mines, you get tunnels, ice houses, cellars. And so anything where the bats can get in and tuck themselves away. And what they're looking for is stable conditions that are cool and have a high humidity. And it's a bit like, I don't know whether you have a glass of water next to your bed when you go to sleep at night.
Yep, tend to.
And same principle that when you're sleeping, you're breathing in and out, you dry out slightly, so you might just need a sip of water. They obviously don't have the luxury of taking a glass into the hibernation site, but if they hibernate in an area that has a high humidity, it means they don't dry out. And so that's the typical pattern that you see where they're tree specialists, those two, but they seem to go underground over winter. We also have a bat called nocturnal bats, which is much more common, more widespread, found all the way up to Scotland, whereas the Bechsteins and Barbastelle generally restricted kind of like southern sections of England and Wales. And the nocturnal is the hardcore one. So they spend all year round in the trees. They're happy in either voids or crevices, so they can go from a woodpecker hole, then across to a hazard beam crack in a tree quite happily. And I think one of the reasons why they hibernate in trees is because it's linked to how they mate. So bats mate in autumn, and they do this amazing thing where after they mate, the females store the sperm over winter. And it means once they come out of hibernation, they can get straight on with feeding, fattening up, ready to give birth to their young, rather than having to add a bit of time to find a mate and what have you in the spring. The Bechsteins and Barbastelle mate by a process known as promiscuity. So we kind of describe this a bit like a bat disco. So the males know where the females are going to be. They're going to go to the hibernation sites to check that they're still there and they're suitable for hibernation. And then they mob them in that process. So they kind of predict their behavior and then they mate with as many as bats as possible during that process. Nocturnal bats are a bit closer to deer. So they set up a territory and they sing. They sing from quite often woodpecker holes to attract females in. Once they've attracted females in, they will mate with them and then they protect the females over the winter. So if you find a nocturnal bat near the entrance of a woodpecker hole late autumn into winter, that's most likely a mating roost and a hibernation roost. And then eventually the females will move out in the spring and then the male bat moves on as well.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And moving things on then, I know that bats often use sound to interpret their surroundings. They use echolocation, and that one of the ways to monitor bats is to listen to the frequencies that they put out and I guess like you could say their voices, right? I guess. And I'm sure there are kind of individual signatures in different types of bat species and maybe even different colonies as well. So on that one, I've got a really basic question for you, which is, have you ever heard a bat with a Bristol accent?
Well, I've heard bats in Bristol, so I'm guessing that must be a Bristol accent, yeah?
Do they have a slightly different accent to some other bats of that species?
The problem is, Tom, I've got a Bristol accent, so maybe I don't recognise it.
Seriously, though, want to spend a bit of time getting your thoughts on that incredible capacity to see through sound.
Yeah, so let's start off with slightly different area to begin with. And have you heard the bats are blind?
I have heard that. Yeah, blind as a bat is a common saying, isn't it?
Do you think that's true?
I think they can see poorly because they do have eyes, which leads me to think that in evolution, they wouldn't have kept the eyes if they didn't serve some kind of benefit.
Yeah, like I think they can actually see very well. It's just being nocturnal, eyesight's not that useful. How good is your eyesight in the dark?
Terrible.
Absolutely,
yeah, that glass of water you mentioned often. That if I'm going for a wee in the night. Probably too much information there, sorry.
So the eyes, depending on the species, some bats have bigger eyes than others, but that's not the main sense they use for navigating or for hunting. And as you've pointed out, what they use instead is echolocation. They use sound. So they emit sound into the environment that bounces off whatever they're surrounded by. So you might have species that are more familiar with clutter. So that could be foliage on trees, tree trunks, or you might have species like the nocturnal bat that feeds in the open. And so they have different approaches to producing sound. So there's a number of different variables when we look at bat sound. The first one is frequency. So when you hear boy racers coming down the road and they're playing their tunes, what notes do you hear first? Do you hear the low end or the top end first?
It's definitely like a boom, 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 boom.
It's the bass, yeah. So the lower frequencies travel further. So our bats that feed and fly in the open have lower frequencies because they need to travel further. Whereas our species that forage at a shorter range, maybe a few meters, have really high frequency calls. And all of the echolocation calls are outside of human hearing. I think if you're a young kid, you might be able to pick up the tail end of some of them, or perhaps more likely the socialization calls that you hear more frequently at certain times of year. But the top end of it is like ultrasound when pregnant people go to have scans to look at the baby, right? It works over a few centimeters, that one, whereas bats, when they have really high frequency echolocation, they forage maybe over a few meters. So frequency is one thing. Then kind of linked to all of this is the call duration, how loud it is, and how quickly they repeat those calls. And again, if you're in the open, you can have a very long call because you've got all the time in the world to wait for it to bounce back, because you're not worried about what's a meter or 2 meters in front of you. You're worried about what's maybe 10 or 50 or 100 meters away from you. Whereas the bats in clutter, they produce very short, very rapid calls, because if they don't, they end up flying into branches or other things. So kind of mixing all those together, you see these fairly characteristic calls. And some echolocation calls allow you to say, yes, it's this species. So our horseshoe bats have very distinctive calls. We only have 2 horseshoes in the UK. You can't mistake them. Like nothing else, they sound like the clangers, if you've ever heard them on a heterotone detector. And the two, whilst they're closely related, the calls are very different frequencies. Then we have a group called the Myotis, a genus called the Myotis, and that's the one the Beckstein's bat is in. But there's 6 species in the UK, a huge number of them around the world, and they have very similar echolocation calls. So they are typically bats of clutter. So they're very short calls that range through a number of frequencies. So it's not just one tone. It's not like a noise. They swipe through like a... But imagine doing that, several times a second. And because they're just like these vertical lines, yeah, they're very tricky to tell apart. I think as we see improvements in machine learning and AI, we'll maybe one day get to a point where you can tell those down to a species level. But the problem is, a lot of the reference calls are from when bats are let go from the hand, and the calls they produce then probably different to when they're out foraging, and they're quite adaptable. So species like pipistrelle produce one type of call when they're in clutter, and then they change it quite dramatically when they're in the open because the conditions have changed. Some big ticks here. Did you see that one I picked off? Yeah, it's a big red one that I picked off. Already. I've been flicking the little baby ones off of me as we've been going. It's not on the risk assessment side.
Listeners, there is no risk assessment with this podcast. So when I was in Fiji, I learnt about some of the bats there, Jim.
Okay.
And there was one called the three-tailed bat. This bat had a really important symbiotic relationship with one particular tree. Fiji's got hundreds of tree species, and it had this one forest species called kaluva, which was quite a small tree, but one that had its flowering behaviours linked directly to the three-tailed bat because it relied on the bat for pollination, and it would only open occasionally at night, this flower, and for one night only, and then the flower's gone basically.
Wow.
And I just found that incredible in terms of those intricacies in nature. I just wondered if you have any similar comparables to that in the niches that UK bats perhaps serve.
So UK bats are all insectivorous. They feed on a range of different invertebrates, and that can range from the ones you might expect, the flying insects, the beetles, flies, crane flies, etc. But they can also land on the ground and forage for things like millipedes or caterpillars and things like that as well. They forage in a range of different ways. But we don't see the same kind of intricate relationships you do elsewhere in the world between bats and particular plant species, as you mentioned. So there's a whole raft of fruit that are only pollinated by bats. It's one of the kind of main messages in those countries of trying to promote bat conservation, because it's obviously good for the local communities, the economy, and as well as the kind of conservation of the species as well. But yeah, in the UK, they're not as interesting, I guess, in that regard, because they just feed on insects. So we're primarily talking about that role of a predator in the ecosystem. And so I'm sure you've had this before of like people ask questions of like, oh, what's the point of this? What's the point of wasps? Or what's the point of midges or whatever it is, without kind of realizing if you just zoom in so much on one aspect of an ecosystem, any answer you provide is functionally meaningless anyway, that clearly they are all interconnected and support one another. If people haven't seen bats foraging, it's well worth popping over to YouTube, and there's a clip from David Attenborough's Life of Mammals with a natterer's bat taking a spider out of a cobweb. It's a cool clip.
When you were saying about, how we value other living things, my brain actually went to thinking about the cultural value. And I know that bats can have a little bit of a dark kind of connotation definitely a sort of mysterious one. And I wonder what your thoughts are on the whole Batman thing, actually.
Yeah, I think it's certainly dark in Western cultures. I think if you go elsewhere, they can actually be revered and seen as important. So it does depend on the culture that you're in. I get asked about Batman a lot, actually, or get called Batman a lot. Not a fan, just like a rich dude, right, with some gadgets. I'm not hugely into superheroes anyway. But I think of all of them, like, what a rubber. He doesn't have any superpowers. He's not really a superhero, is he?
Just drives an expensive car.
He does, yeah. Maybe I'm jealous. Maybe I want an expensive car and a cave, and who knows. But part of that's that metaphor for the underbelly of society, right? And like the mystique of darkness, and kind of what I mentioned about why bats and kind of what they mean to me. And there's an unknown there, isn't there? So I think that's perhaps why it's difficult to turn this tide, that if people don't see these species, how can we expect them to care about them? And it's hard to actually show people these species, because getting them out to where those species are, where the bats are, is challenging.
Yeah, having worked with trees for getting on for 2 decades now, I've come across quite a few bat folk, and I'm always in awe of how unsociable the hours are that they need to kind of put the time in on to really understand those kind of animals. And I suppose that will probably attract people that might feel a bit out of the normal 9 to 5 kind of loop in a way, or needing a bit of that in their life. Is that fair to assume? Or yeah, what are the kind of breadth of bat personalities that you've come across?
Bat people are weird. Like, they are weird. And I count myself in that. I'm fine to count myself in that. Yeah, I think it does attract a certain type of person. And I've got lots of batty friends, and they're all weird and mad in their own ways.
I'm really glad you said that, because I'm not allowed to say that.
I did think you were heading there, like, initially. And then you're like, I'm in awe of these people.
I genuinely am. I think, just they're never not interesting.
I think science generally attracts certain types of people. I've recently discovered I'm autistic, which with hindsight is so flippin' obvious. I've always made observations of ecologists in particular, that there's a huge number of them that don't want to engage with people. They want to go and study their thing. And I thought that was like poor social skills or something in that area. But I think there's a huge amount of neurodiversity, both diagnosed and undiagnosed, in ecology. And part of it's that you don't quite fit that square peg into a round hole for the kind of normal, quote, jobs. And so you end up going to study bats because, as you say, you can do it under the cover of darkness, or you can kind of have a bit more freedom or leeway doing what you want to do. So yeah, I think it certainly attracts a certain type of person. It's been one for me where I'm trying to change that and think a little bit differently, I guess. I used to think about, well, we just need to do the science, because once you do the science, then everything will be okay. Then we'll crack conservation, right? And I've kind of realized fairly quickly into my career that we know a reasonable amount. Of course, there's always more to learn. What we perhaps need to do is act on what we know and convince people to do something about it, convince people that these things are important. So I've kind of moved more towards that now, and I try to take my career more into engaging with people, working out how I communicate as effectively as possible. I've used a few analogies or comparisons from your life in this conversation about a glass of water, and just my brain has always thought of those types of things, which seems to land with people.
Yeah, and I know that's something you've really kind of worked hard at developing, is your own communication style. That's been something you've had to learn along the way, isn't it, I guess? And I know you're really well regarded as a trainer. I always find your talks really engaging and logical. And actually, yeah, you take people on a journey when you present, Jim, I would say.
Cool. Nice to hear. Thank you.
So yeah, just thought it would be nice to ask you, in terms of where you are currently with communication, any particular things sort of sticking out for you where you're like, yeah, this feels like important as part of the recipe for any talk or kind of effort to persuade?
Yeah, so my craft has been influenced largely by sitting at conferences, symposia, and just watching very boring speakers drone on about their topic and say things like, oh, you won't be able to read this chart, but I put it on the slides anyway. And every time someone says that, in my head, I scream out like, why? Why have you done that? So it's largely been crafted by looking at what other people do badly and say, well, just don't do that. And then that gives you fewer options to try. And I think we need to be braver. We need to start being more creative with how we approach these things and be willing to try them and accept that actually we might not get it right the first time or every time, but that kind of doesn't matter. One of the tools I've used recently, or analogies I've used recently, was about the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, whatever crisis you want to kind of focus on, because we seem to be facing so many. And I say to people that are worried about getting it wrong or failing, okay, I'm going to take us back in time. It's 1912. We are on the Titanic, right? You've had your romp in the car and it's hit the iceberg. So it's going down. You're below deck at this point, by the way. That ship is sinking. Do you think that the people around you would look at you and judge you for doing everything you can to get off of that boat? You'd be trying this door, this gate, this barrier, whatever it is, and you keep going until you've got an answer, you've got a solution. And I think if we accept that we're in a crisis, then we just need to keep trying. We need to keep trying until we land on something that works. And it won't be permanently right. We need to change and we need to evolve, we need to adapt and move over. I've had the pleasure of working for a number of great charities in my time. When I left one of them, we were recruiting new trainers and we had interviews, like half an hour online or so. We asked people to come prepared to give a 15-minute presentation, like mini training session. So the first part of it was generic questions of like, what do you think makes a good training session? And people would say, you need to be engaged. Oh yeah, good, tick. You need to avoid death by PowerPoint. Oh yeah, good, tick. And you go through those questions, they say all the right things, and then they go, great, now it's the point in the interview for you to present. And they just go and do all the things they told you not to do. And so people know this stuff, but I think there's an issue with applying it for some reason. There's a block there that people doesn't get through. And whether that's because most of what people see is a set way, loads of black text on a white background on a PowerPoint slide. If you're lucky, you've got an image, which probably isn't anything to do with what you're talking about. So like, why? And if you think about what we see on TV or in films, do you see lots of text other than the start of Star Wars, maybe? Do you see lots of text with an out of focus image? No, you don't. You see images, you see videos, right? I did some work on storytelling for the Woodland Trust and worked with a friend of mine who's an actor. Just seen him on the big screen, by the way. Oh, yeah. The Salt Path. You seen the Salt Path?
Not yet. No, heard good things about it though.
Yeah, James Fisher. He's the sheep shearer. If you see him. He talked about in TV, film, theatre, there's this principle known as show, don't tell. And that's about treating the viewer with respect, that they're intelligent things. And you don't have to tell them these things, you can just show them. So I'm going to pick a film.
Yeah.
Do you know Die Hard?
I know Die Hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So opening scenes of Die Hard 1 is there's a guy on a plane. He's flying from New York to Los Angeles to go and see his wife for a Christmas party. When he gets there, he asks the receptionist, says like the name of his wife, and the receptionist says, oh no, you put it into that machine there. And it's a bit like the machine you have at the doctors now where you put names in, right?
Yeah.
And so he goes to Holly McLean, but is not there. So he thinks for a second, he comes back out and goes to Holly Gennaro, and he looks visibly annoyed by this. So in that opening scene, you've got a couple which are other ends of the country. So they're separated, and she's now going by her maiden name, not her married name. That tells you a huge amount about their relationship, and they've not said anything. They've treated you with that kind of respect that you can pick up on that about the basis of this film and why these different things are happening. And I try to use that in like everything I do. Don't tell me, show me. So I kind of hold that close to everything I do now. So there's very little text at all on my slides and presentations. It's important, it's useful to have from time to time. I've deliberately got out of the way to get good photos and just kind of really leaning into these different creative arts. Like, there's a reason why people go to the cinema and watch TV, go to photography exhibitions, because they're showing you these amazing things, right? Like, words are great, words are important, but like, it's that showing people of it. Like, you can say what you like about bats, but if I can show you a video of bats or a photo of bats, that changes everything.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's given me a few things to think about, actually. Difficult to show people on a podcast, actually. But obviously there are...
Different medium though,
It's
right?
a different medium, yeah. But I think at the same time, I am conscious of, if you like, leading the podcast in a way that hopefully demonstrates a certain curiosity, certain behaviours as well. Hopefully the value of listening, I would imagine.
I think that's come across in all of the episodes I've listened to date. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Well, another thing about the podcast, actually, is that when I look at the places that people listen to it, actually Bristol comes up top. And I just,
Does it?
It's really important to me in this interview that I check with you that it's not just you.
I've got my iPad, I've got my phone, I've got my Mac, just playing them all simultaneously.
I knew it, man. I knew it. Damn, that's like half the figures.
Bristol's a great place. Have you been to Bristol?
I've been a few times, yeah. Always had a great time, actually.
I can see, shout out Bristol crew who must be listening right now, I guess. Right? It's a great place. I grew up in Bristol. I've moved out of Bristol because I wanted to be more in the countryside, away from people a little bit. But we go back so frequently, huge amount of live music, huge amount of great food, particular vegan stuff as well. We went this year, what's his name? DJ, I can't remember his name now, but he's a DJ on a bike. And there was like this mobile rave where you could cycle along with him whilst he's just mixing drum and bass. And it was just absolute carnage, but like, yeah, it's just amazing. It's a good place. So yeah, I'm not surprised that people in Bristol love trees. We've not talked about trees a lot.
We haven't talked about trees much, no. And actually, I know before we started recording, you said that you'd like to get in there how we met as well. So
yeah,
maybe it's worth covering
absolutely.
that a little bit.
Sticks in my memory. I think I've got a photo of you actually doing this. I should share it, send it to you if I haven't done already. When Tom and I first met, I was working for a small charity called the Ancient Tree Forum. You were at National Trust. Were you doing the job you do now?
I was
Sheffield
just
Park,
about to
was it?
step into it just before the pandemic hit.
It was, yeah. So anyway, if you've not heard of the Ancient Tree Forum, have a Google. They do some amazing things. One of the great things they do is they have regional groups where they go around, they visit sites and they discuss all things ancient tree. So whether that's about the ecology and the species that live in them, whether that's about the history or the culture associated with how landscapes were managed, and a whole range of things. And we were concluding a walk around the site, and the last attraction, I guess, last thing that we did was I turned round and saw Tom stood inside of a hollow oak tree, and he read a poem. What was the name of the poem?
The Oldest Friend.
The Oldest Friend. And it really stuck in my mind because like the Ancient Tree Forum attracts quite a diversity of people in terms of background of like interests of why they like old trees. But they're generally like scientific people, I would say. And yeah, it really stuck in my mind because it was different. It was cool. It made the hair stand up on my arm. It's about that creativity, that willingness to do something, to stand up in front of like a group of very sciencey people and read a poem from inside a tree. And I thought, all credit to you, Tom. It was amazing. And I had the privilege of organising the following year's 2-day conference, essentially, Ancient Tree Forum, Summer Forum. And I got you along to chair one of the sessions, and you did a slightly tweaked version at the beginning of that, didn't you? Yeah. And it absolutely raised the roof. And so, yeah, it was a nice way to kind of meet you and really appreciate what you do for raising the awareness of old trees and just kind of looking at things slightly differently, Tom. So thanks for all your hard work. Thanks for having me on here as well, because we need people to think differently, to not be afraid to do things differently, because we need to reach as many people as possible about these amazing old trees.
humbled and appreciate your backing. And yeah, you're definitely someone I think as well that is not afraid to kind of add new strings to your bow and keep things moving forward and keeping your mind open really about what new skills or angles that you can get on changing the things that matter to you, I guess, for the better, influencing, I should say. And from the new to the old, I'm just making a tenuous link there to the fact that after this recording, we're going to go and visit a tree that's pretty special to you. But before that, maybe you could take us there in your mind's eye. How about that, Jim, for our listeners?
Sure.
What are you expecting to see when you get there? Bearing in mind you might not have seen this tree for a while. Why does it appeal to you?
It's probably 10 years or so. I think it has a place in my heart because it's not far from here. And this, where we are, is where you can park the car in the forest. And we used to use this as a base. So like behind me this way, there are bat boxes.
Yeah.
And there's a pond. We used to catch bats at the pond. And in that way, there's a few bat boxes. But then if you go far enough, you get to this tree. And it's called pointing oak. And next to pointing oak, when I first started studying bats, was a dead monolith. Don't think it was managed that way. I think it just died and was decaying hulk. And that was a barbastelle tree roost underneath lifting bark. As we've talked about, it doesn't last forever, of course. And one of the early conservation measures was that they stuck up, the rangers here stuck up a load of carpet tiles to mimic lifting bark. And would you know it? The bats used it. They also put bat boxes on it. And low down, they cut some chainsaw slots as well, which are like the bar of a chainsaw twisted like 90 degrees so it's flat. And they were quite low down, but pipistrelles used to use those as well. So I think it was just a familiarity with it. It's a wonderful open-grown oak tree. It's called pointing oak because it had these limbs that radiated out, which tells you it was an open-grown oak tree because if it grew up in shade, it would go upright. But it doesn't point anymore. It certainly didn't used to point when I knew it because that limb had torn out. But it's actually that tear out, the limb that had been ripped from the tree that made it so good for bats. And the barbastelle bats were using that back then. I don't know if they still do. But yeah, I think it exemplifies everything about trees to me that's so fascinating, that they are both living and dead at the same time, that the people often fixate on the past, what they see is wrong with it, like dead limbs or decay. And that doesn't matter to the tree. That's a decision it made before. What it wants to know is what's happening next. So if you look up here, we have a dead branch on this beech tree. Dead probably because it's shaded out. It's no longer needed by the tree. Is that a mistake? No, it's not a mistake at all. That's absolutely what the tree needed to do. It's grown up past that. It doesn't need that anymore, so it can decommission it. And so if we fixate on the past, if we fixate on what we as humans think is wrong, decay, cavities, splits, then actually we're kind of missing the point with this. There is this duality of life and death that makes trees so amazing. If they didn't decay, if they healed themselves rather than just sealed off and then carried on growing, then you wouldn't get cavities, you wouldn't get decaying wood, you wouldn't get all these things that make them so incredible for wildlife. And so, yeah, it helps me view the world differently and appreciate that we need to focus on the positive, focus on the future rather than dwell too much on the past.
There's the tree bit, Jim. I knew it would come in. Thank you, man. And I'm really excited to go and see this tree with you and maybe get
I've got to find it first. I'm not sure. It's that way, roughly.
Is it one of those with a sign?
It is, yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
great.
yeah.
Yeah, that should help.
But that gate's new.
Well, we have got your special infrared and see in the dark binoculars. So if we're here hours later, we're going to find that thing, mate.
We will find it. We will find it.
Thank you so much for resting and pausing to chat. I know you're busy and it's been a total pleasure chatting with you. As you know, in these podcast episodes, as Bristol's #1 listener, I always hand over to my guests at the end to sign us off. So over to you.
Great stuff. Well, thanks also for having me. Big fan of the podcast. And thanks for taking the time to come out and actually do it in amongst the trees. I couldn't think of a better location to talk about bats and trees. But yeah, like the last thing I'll leave people with, I've touched on a bit already, which is think differently. Don't fixate on what other people think is bad or wrong. You'll find that out yourself. Keep trying until you find the thing that works for you.
You've been listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, leave a comment and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And see you next time.